For Action News, I'm Anna Dulosky. The antibiotic crisis is in the news today after President Obama issued an executive order to establish a task force with the sole purpose of developing a strategy to combat antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Better late than never, right? Of course, we think anything that addresses the problem is welcome news, but we cannot forget the FDA's strict clinical trial requirements in the 90s is what drove companies out of research in the first place. We've talked to ACTIA advisor Dr. David Schlaze many times in the past about antibiotic resistance, and we caught up with him today to talk about the pros and the cons of the report.
Some of the really good things in the report are, as far as I'm concerned, strengthening state and local public health infrastructure for surveillance and response. I think that's a really important effort. Using sequencing to look at dissemination of pathogens, for example. I think that's an important effort. Expanding fundamental research relevant to developing new antibiotics. I think that's a really important effort. There's a note about developing new regulatory pathways. And here I think it's a little bit nuanced, but the FDA has been pushing for legislation, which is now part of ADAPT, is the name of the bill going through Congress now, which would essentially give a congressional signature to these kinds of new regulatory pathways that they're proposing for new antibiotics against resistant pathogens, whereby the trials will be much smaller, but the labels would also be more restrictive. But I've been saying for a very long time that they don't need legislation to do this. They already have the statutory authority to do it, and basically PCAST agrees with that stance. That is, that the FDA doesn't need new legislation, and they can do a lot without any new legislation. The best part of the report, I thought, was the push for the federal government to increase economic incentives for developing urgently needed antibiotics. That, I thought, was a very important part, the most important part of the report for me. Areas that I was disappointed in the report were two areas. The biggest one was that there's no money. So either these agencies, mainly HHS, is going to have to dig this money out of their existing budget. And this is a lot of money they're talking about, so I don't know where this money's coming from. Or there has to be new legislation. And I don't see any new legislation authorizing any money for anything. The other thing that disappointed me was their reluctance to call on the FDA to regulate the use of antibiotics in animals and in agriculture. I thought that was very disappointing. The PCAST seemed to indicate that they thought that the data wasn't strong, linking the use of antibiotics in agriculture to problems with resistance in humans. And I think the data is overwhelming. There's a lot of things in this report, like they want to establish a new sort of task force, an interagency task force. Well, there's been an interagency task force on antibiotic resistance since the 90s. I was, one of their consultants in 1991. And the problem with this idea is that you're getting all these agencies together. Number one, all these agencies compete with each other for funding. Number two, they hate talking to each other. It's like the FBI and the CIA. They hate talking to each other. So I'm not sure how well all that is going to work, and I don't know, there's nothing here that makes me think this is going to work any better than any of the previous committees and task forces that have been appointed. So I think the idea is a good one. I think the only way to make it work will be for President Obama to step on somebody. Maybe he will, but based on past performance, I'm very skeptical.
To read Dr. Schlaze's entire blog post, you can head to our website, actia.org, and while you're there, don't forget to also sign up for your latest dose of news delivered straight to your inbox. For Action News, I'm Anna Dulosky.